Hey, gang, Tim here. And since we're talking about women's basketball, what better way to celebrate and urge you to purchase items from our friends at both oldschoolshirts.com, promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases, and royalretros.com, promo code SEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. Oldschoolshirts.com, again, promo code GOODSEATS, is where you'll find a whole bunch of stuff from the old WBL. We'll be talking about that in a few minutes. The 1970s, early 1980s. The New York Stars, the New Orleans Pride, the New Jersey Gems, tons of other shirts there, as well as a few shirts from the ABL, the 1990s Professional Women's League, to teams like the San Jose Lasers and the Nashville Noise. And again, royalretros.com, promo code SEATS, you'll find a whole bunch of great shirts from some of the early teams of the WNBA that for whatever reason aren't around anymore, whether they went defunct or moved elsewhere. You remember the Utah Stars with 2 Z's, or the Miami Soul, or the Orlando Miracle, or perhaps the Cleveland Rockers, or even the Tulsa Shock. A few of those and others there at royalretros.com. So check them both out. Again, royalretros.com, promo code SEATS, and oldschoolshirts.com, promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases as we celebrate in this week's episode women's basketball. Here's our show.
One of the greatest things that ever happened to me was the WBL.
The history of the WBL it fills in the gaps. You always want the history to be accurate.
I don't think the young girls understand what it's like to grow up in a world where you can dream of playing women's professional basketball. We didn't have that. So when it happened, we felt a responsibility, of course the excitement to be able to continue to play, but we also felt a responsibility to make it work and to make something stick for the future.
Now we go way back. We played together, we worked hard together, all teams, all across the league did. And what's important to me for people to know is that it started with us. We took nothing for granted. Everything wasn't easy for us, but we did the best we could with what we had because that was what we wanted to do. It was just simply play basketball.
Most of us, a lot of us came from small places. We were the first to play ball because of Title IX. So our story is, the foundation of the whole Title IX movement, so to speak.
You have to start somewhere. And even though the 12 owners of the WBL only had 2 years, it was 2 very impactful years.
The ones that are playing now and the ones in the future, they need to know where they come from and how it all started. Not to knock that what they're doing is not good, it's good. But know where your history started.
And I'm thankful to the Wings that they care about their history.
If you don't know where you started, how can you truly gauge how far you've come?
And we certainly here at this organization know where we came from.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, hello. How are you, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon. It is Good Seats Still Available. It is the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. I cannot thank you enough for finding us this week and hope you and yours are doing well as the summer light seems to becoming more dim by the week. And hopefully it's been enjoyable for you thus far and you're squeezing out every last moment of joy you can from the summer season. This week, we bounce our way back to the incredibly intriguing world of women's basketball. And no better time than now. Talk about a point in time, an era that we're in as the reascendance of the WNBA. And we'll talk about that, its beginnings and its sag for a number of years, and its reincarnation, rebirth, if you will. Especially with mega stars like Caitlin Clark and numerous others that just seem to be filling the pipeline and growing ratings and all kinds of opportunities that I would imagine some of the ladies that you heard in that setup clip there would have just never dreamed of 40, 50 years ago. But we're going to be talking about the entirety of the incredible history of this game and getting into perhaps setting the stage for what is today's and tomorrow's WNBA. With our guests this week, Pamela Grundy and Susan Shackelford, and also in celebration, frankly, of the reissue of the book that they put out about, almost 20 years ago now. This is during some of the early years of the WNBA, called Shattering the Glass, the remarkable history of women's basketball. It's being republished by the University of North Carolina Press, and we'll tell you how to get a copy of that, of course. But of course, you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, search up this episode number 408. You'll find a couple of convenient links right there to get various flavors of this book. But let's talk about that setup clip, because there's a lot of history here that we're going to go through. And women's basketball is a relatively modern history, yet it's not. Meaning that the professional version of women's basketball has really been kind of a more fairly modern phenomenon. I mean, we're literally talking about 1978 with the establishment of something called the Women's Basketball League. Now, as a reminder, we've had a few WBL conversations in the past, and I highly encourage you to go seek these out, starting with our episode number 28, one of our first ever episodes, with the great Molly Bolin, or Molly Kazmer, as she's known now, Machine Gun Molly Bolin, as she was known then, perhaps one of the most famous names from that women's professional basketball league, the WBL, back in the late 70s, early 80s. And she was also with us for our episode number 256, the WBL roundtable conversation that we had with her. And one of the voices that you just heard on that clip there, Liz Galloway McQuitter, who was on the Chicago Hustle team, if you remember there. It also in that clip that you heard there were the great Nancy Lieberman, who not only played in the WBL, but was in the exquisite sweet spot to then also be able to play a couple of years in the early years of the WNBA, a great connective tissue there, if you will, from the first pro league to the one of the second, if you will, pro leagues. Of course, I'm not forgetting the ABL, the American Basketball League. We'll talk about that in our conversation coming up. But besides Nancy Lieberman, who was also a coach, I think she played with the Dallas Diamonds of the WBL. And that's the connection there with the Dallas Wings, from which this clip came from. In addition to Ms. Lieberman, you had Retha Swindell, who was also on the Dallas Diamonds team. She was featured in that clip, as well as I said, Liz Galloway McQuitter, and Deborah Thomas, who was the teammate of Molly Bolin's, now Molly Kazmer, on the Iowa Cornets, a couple of teams from the old WBL. And that clip comes from the Dallas Wings and their throwback from about 2 years ago. Their roots, if you will, their memories of what came before them. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about. But it's interesting, too. We're going to kind of really talk about some of the key turning points in the evolution of the women's game. And yeah, the origins go back as early as men's basketball does. Barnstorming, the All-American Redheads, the collegiate game, especially in the 1970s, really started to pick up, which is where a lot of the action was. But we're going to kind of circle around sort of three major sort of points, although there are others. Elizabeth Galloway McQuitter, in her recent TED Talk, TEDx in Boston from a couple of years back, kind of encapsulated it into what she calls a triad of not only the WBL, which was the first true funded professional basketball league in the United States for women in hoops, but also the AIAW, which at the time, in the 1970s, was the coalescence of this emerging women's college game. As a predecessor to the NCAA later on, but was a hugely important formative component of taking a relatively, I would call it ragtag, but sort of widely dispersed and unevenly dispersed women's college game to give it some structure, including playing of championships and that kind of stuff. And again, setting the table for what ultimately would be the NCAA coming in a number of years later in the early 80s. And of course, probably the root of all of this growth, especially in the modern era in the last 40, 50 years. Title IX, the landmark legislation that created equality opportunities for women, specifically in the sports realm. But we also had the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, that was going on through various state legislatures in the early 1970s, coming this close to being passed and stuff. So this is a story not only about the evolution of women's basketball and the elements of the pro game, both in the WBL, today's WNBA, the ABL, which makes an appearance, and some other components too. But certainly the Olympics in 1976 were very fundamental to all this too. This is a story also of just the game in general. And frankly, if you're a fan of the male version of the game, or you don't consider yourself a women's sports fanatic, or frankly just find it just not part of your sports upbringing history, this is immensely illuminating, this conversation as well as this history, and it's also an amazing pile of teams and leagues that don't exist anymore that we love to obsess about. The WNBA has had its issues, and certainly the Dallas Wings, for example, right, were previously incarnated as the Detroit Shock, which won, I think, 3 early WNBA championships, and they moved to Tulsa for 5 years. People forget that. They were the Tulsa Shock. And then when they moved to the Dallas-Fort Worth area, they became the Wings, and then started to look back and over the last couple of years, remembering the fact that Dallas had a WBL team. So this is all part of the history of sports and leagues and teams and logos and all that kind of stuff that we love to obsess about, whether it's women or men or co-ed, like we've seen with the International Volleyball Association. We love it all. And we're just tickled pink to have Pamela Grundy and Susan Shackelford for our now upcoming conversation as we talk about shattering that glass. We're going to go through, so buckle up, this amazing and sometimes incredulous history of women's basketball, and just frankly how long it took to get the pro game up and running, and now undoubtedly successful and hopefully long-term so. Let's get into that chat that we had just a couple of weeks back, our conversation with Pamela and Susan. Please, as always, enjoy. As I hinted in my little note to you, it is not a quiz to the two of you on the pro game specifically and or exclusively, but I do want to weave it into this revised story that you guys have brought out again, because I think it's timely as all get out, because the women's game is just on fire right now, and you could not have timed it better, I don't think.
Yeah,
That was luck.
it was luck.
Well, okay. So let's start. Why don't you both identify yourselves for our audience, and maybe a little bit of background on each of yourselves as to your adjunct to the game, because you guys sort of share, experience as scribes of sorts, but also other stuff. What's your entree to the game, to the story, and all of that stuff?
Sure. I'll jump in. This is Susan, and I got exposed to basketball very young. My dad was a girls and boys basketball coach, and I just followed around in his shadow and loved the game. And then later went to journalism school and took up sports writing. And this was in the 70s. There weren't many women doing it. And basketball was one of the things I covered.
Back when sports writing was a real thing, right, Susan?
It really was. In
Yeah.
fact, it was kind of a proving ground for a lot of writers, regardless of whether they wanted to stay there or whether they wanted to advance a writing career, because there was so much variety of what you did. I was thinking about it just today, and how at a very young age, 22 years old, full time, I was writing columns, I was writing news, I was writing news features, all in the realm of sports. So yeah, it was quite a time.
And where was college for you?
At UNC Chapel Hill.
Oh, sure. So a great journalism school there. So you were well equipped, plus obviously being essentially in the cradle of certainly the college game, at least, no?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I got to cover the women there on a full-time basis and was the first reporter doing that. I kind of carved that out when I came there and then advanced on the student paper with the opportunity to be an editor and then be the sports editor. And I covered Dean Smith and his Tar Heels during my time there as well. It was quite a ripe time for me to be able to see some great basketball.
And I will, as I always say, because Susan's modest, she was the first woman to be the head sports editor at the Daily Tar Heel. So, she was really a pioneer.
No, and that's
Yeah.
as a former college journalist myself, I went to Georgetown. We only had a once a week newspaper called The Hoya, although we've got a number of great alums. To be able to do that again and have a daily newspaper as my parallel education, I would have loved to have done that, had that chance, and I just know that's it's a stellar paper. It continues to be.
Yeah, it is. I was reading in alumni news that they continue to win awards at the national level. And, at the journalism school I'm speaking of particularly, they compete and their students excel year to year. And in the paper, went independent several years back. Like a lot of newspapers, they wanted to get more invested in sponsorships, be divorced from any politics, that might be in play with the university or another organization. And they're still doing really great work. I mean, they work hard every day on the business side and the writing and production side.
And that independence is a real key to making all that kind of stuff happen. And frankly, God bless. I mean, because journalism and students being still interested in it, and God forbid, hopefully finding renewed forms of careers in it are absolutely essential. And I would argue too, historians as well. So Susan, I'm not going to put you out into the pasture here, because those who ignore history are doomed to repeat it. And you're a historian, I think, mostly by trade, right? But also, what's your overlap into this story that we're getting into?
Well, I think are you talking to me now, Tim? Sorry, Pam.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Pam.
Anyway, I was just thinking, Susan, it's so interesting. You learn all these things. I did some journalism as well. And as I recall, I didn't work for my high school paper, but I worked for a little weekly that was in our community. And I definitely proved myself with sports. That was my first, assignment, as it were, to cover the high school sports teams. So that's interesting to think about. I then went on to do some other things and end up really focusing on history. And it is very true. I went to Chapel Hill for graduate school. So Susan and I have that in common. We are both Tar Heels. And at that time, and I won't say how many years ago it was, sports history was still kind of on the edges. It was a little daring, particularly when you were getting started, to do a sports history dissertation.
Try doing a podcast about it, but I digress.
Well, I know, but the point being that other academics might not see it as serious. And so your job prospects were potentially less if you had done a sports history as opposed to, one of the endless political dissertations that had been done, or if you did something that was very, more specific, say women's history, but that was more clearly settled in the academic canon. Sports was not. I think that has changed a great deal over, the past decades, because people have started to see how important sports really is to understanding, particularly, I think, U.S. history, just how many different insights at all sorts of different aspects of society throughout history. And of course, students like it, so that's popular as well. So it really has picked up. And so I was interested, and I got involved in basketball. I'd done sports history, I'd done some basketball. I was here in North Carolina, so that was, I understood the significance. And I was teaching a sports history class. And I realized when I was actually teaching at Davidson College, I was actually teaching part-time there when Steph Curry was there and when they went to the Final Four. It was all very exciting. But I realized that there were no good women's sports history books that you could assign to undergraduates. There are a couple of very high level things that just really didn't work for them. And so I felt like there needed to be a book on women's sports. And I felt like probably basketball was the best because women had been playing basketball since its invention. All different kinds of women played basketball, just like all different, communities of men had played basketball because it was cheap and, didn't take a lot of people. And so I didn't want to write it though, because I knew the history, but I wasn't a giant basketball fan. And I didn't know that much about the more recent aspects. So I spent several years trying to get other people to write it. I would go around and I would say, there should be a history of women's basketball. You could write it, but I never convinced anyone. And then lo and behold, Susan moved across the street from me. And we still live across the street from each other. And I knew Susan from some earlier work, and I knew she was had been a sports writer. She was a big women's basketball fan. And one day it just hit me, Susan and I could write this book together. And
Coincidence? I don't think so.
No, it was meant to be, obviously. But I usually stop here and let Susan pick up the story.
Yeah, I had met Pam when she interviewed me for something, and then years went by. And, I wound up moving, as she said, across the street. And we were like, oh my gosh, we're across the street from each other. So a little while went by, and then Pam proposed this. And I was so excited. I said, I'm like really too excited about this. I need to think about it. Let me sleep on it. So the next day, of course, I reached out and said, yeah, let's figure out a plan. Let's do this. I had been a sports writer after college for a number of years with the Miami Herald and then with the Charlotte Observer, and then opened my own writing business and covered all kinds of things, including sports. And so to kind of get back to the roots of how I started and to touch base into the women's game really, really excited me. A lot had changed, a lot had grown, and I felt like we had really a great idea, or Pam did rather, to try to get all this down.
Well, yeah, one thing, Susan, that you'd done was you covered the Charlotte Sting, which actually was still going at the time.
Right. The Sting being one of those early WNBA teams, and I ironically may come back in some form. Or I've heard that Charlotte may be an expansion candidate, and that the Sting name might be, I don't know. I hear so many rumors now, but WNBA, all bets are off, it seems now.
Yeah, I mean, I think, they named 3 teams, three months ago or so, and they did not make the mix then. And I have not actually heard anything since then. But prior to that, there was a lot of scuttlebutt here in Charlotte, people talking about it. So I would love to know where they stand, because the WNBA seems poised to go a little beyond those 3 teams, it seems to me, just based on kind of, reading things. I don't have any inside knowledge, but certainly would love to see Charlotte come back in the mix. I not only covered them, I also was a charter season ticket holder. I held tickets all 10 years that they were here, and it was just thrilling to have a team here in my hometown and all the incredible players, Dawn Staley, Charlotte Smith, Andrea Stinson, Rhonda Mapp. I could go on, and they performed for many years at the top level of the league.
So this is the fact that you guys put your heads together to do this. And this is a reissue, right? When did the book first come out?
2005. This is the 20th anniversary.
Oh my goodness. Okay, I didn't realize it went that far back. So
my God.
So the iron has only gotten hotter, right? Since the first book, right? So this not only were you onto something then, but now you're more. I mean, it's all kismet. So let me sort of propose this sort of as a divining rod here. So the 70s tends to be kind of a divining line for a lot of conversations around pro sports and stuff, and it's sports generally. Um, Largely maybe because I was a kid during that decade, but also, um, we've had a great conversation. For example, Michael McCambridge has a book came out last year called The Big Time, which is basically dedicated to the 1970s and sports and how things sort of came of age, if you will, in the modern era. Um, and it's interesting because I actually, coming into this book, into this topic, I'm certainly aware of the WNBA, certainly very aware of the WBL, a little bit of the ABL and that kind of stuff. And but the more I read your stuff here, it's almost like it's like a BC and AD kind of demarcation, I think. You tell me if I'm wrong, where there's like the before the 70s stuff, which you go into great detail and some great stuff. We'll get into some of that. And then the velocity just seems to be an acceleration from the mid 70s onward to maybe where we are now, maybe with a little bit of a speed bump a decade or so ago. But I mean, am I right or wrong to maybe put sort of an artificial, Mendoza line there? And or how did you come to frame the historical narrative here for putting this book together?
Well, there's a couple things to that. I mean, one, I think it's important that you mentioned speed bump because women's basketball goes up and down, basically with, in many ways, the sense of what women's place in society is supposed to be, which also goes up and down. Moments of openness, like the 20s when you have the flappers and the just a more open way of women can do more things. They can smoke, skirts can be short. And then there are eras like the 50s where it's much more locked down. You're supposed to be in the kitchen and all the advertisements and all. And so it's up and down. And that's the same as you said. When we first did the book, we thought it was just going to take off then because you'd had the 96 Olympics, you'd started these leagues, the ABL and then the WNBA. The WNBA was carrying on. We just thought it was going to take off. And obviously it didn't. But I do think you're absolutely right for the 70s and specifically for women's sports because of Title IX. I mean, before Title IX, women's sports thrived here and there in certain communities that supported it. For example, Tuskegee, the university in Alabama, the black school, they were very supportive of women's sports and trained some of the best female track athletes in the world, who, would compete at the Olympics and that sort of thing, the Tennessee Tiger Bells. There were textile mill communities that were very supportive of women's basketball, and they had, great teams. But until Title IX, it was here and there, hit and miss. But after Title IX, essentially it said that the federal government was going to require all schools to give women equal sports opportunities with men. And that nothing like that had ever happened. And, of course, that has continued. I mean, it's taken a while to get even sort of close to equal, but, but that has been just a consistent support and resource support because the colleges have to do it. And so that is when the sport really any of the sports began to consolidate and you began to see consistent support for and interest in, particularly on the part of young women who wanted to get college scholarships.
Yeah, and Title IX was also grounded in the women's rights movement from the late 60s and 70s. So you had that big, societal push, and then you had Title IX there to take advantage of that. Women, much like the 1920s, as Pam pointed out, were feeling more agency, more ability to go to college, to get college scholarships and things like that, which were part of Title IX. And it really began, it was at its core an education bill centered around those kind of opportunities. And then the athletics got kind of, I don't know, I wouldn't say tacked on. It was always part of it, but people did not make a big deal out of it because some of the insiders knew if they did, it would be really tough to get that bill passed.
Well,
And I
sure.
think,
Yeah, go
oh,
ahead.
go ahead. I was going to say the key being at this point, people thought, oh, well, we need to get women. There were places where women weren't allowed to take engineering classes. This was this kind of thing. It's like, well, we just need to open up, this world and let women into it. And what people didn't think, it was so ingrained in people's consciousness, thinking, well, men play sports and women don't, that nobody except for these few people on the inside who were into women's sports said, oh my goodness, if we say equal educational opportunities, we're going to have to gear up an entire women's sports program at every school, which is going to be really expensive. I mean, that was kind of a shock for many people because they just never imagined. They didn't realize that, a school would spend, at that point, it doesn't sound much now, but like they'd spend $1.6 million on their men's sports programs and $2,000 on their women's programs. I mean, that's what the differences were.
Well, you also mentioned too, right? I mean, a lot of this history of the women's game parallels, the plight and or the advancements of women generally in society in this country, right? And or globally too, for that matter. I mean, the Equal Rights Amendment, right, was a major initiative for a number of years and came pretty darn close to actually being amended into the Constitution around this time too. So in many respects, this conversation is kind of almost a microcosm of that. The Title IX thing and all the creation of the AIAW, right, which essentially was, I guess it seems to me, based on what I've read, is kind of like the first real kind of focused, women's centric collegiate umbrella, if you will, to facilitate play. But that didn't even come until what, the mid 1970s, right? I mean, it's incredible. It's really hard to think through that it took literally that long to kind of get to these kinds of levels of even consideration of equality, of opportunity, and then even the beginnings of infrastructure that could then facilitate it and allow it to grow and become more of a thing.
Yeah, and Susan, who experienced that, I mean, you can talk about your personal experience in high school and college related to the lack of opportunity.
Oh yeah, I grew up in a small town in North Carolina where there was definitely an opportunity for me to play high school basketball. But then my family moved to Raleigh, and it was, one of those areas like Pam described. Some areas around Raleigh had girls basketball, some areas didn't. I begged my family to please move to the county because I wanted to play when I was old enough. I was going into sixth grade, and I really wanted to play. So they were very accommodating. My dad, by that time, was doing a different education job. He left the classroom, but he was still a big sports person, big advocate. So when I got to high school, we had one sport for girls. It was the basketball team. And virtually every year, including right up to when I graduated in 72, we were fighting to keep that team or to keep a decent playing time or to have uniforms that fit us. And it was just an ongoing battle. Um, and then when I got to college, I was sitting in a class one day and a professor walked by and dropped this big sheath of papers on my desk and said, read this. By that time, I was already covering sports at the Daily Tar Heel. And I said to her, well, what is it? She said, just read it and call me. So I did. And it was the draft regulations for Title IX. And I could not believe it. I started calling all around the state of North Carolina, and other than a few women's coaches, nobody had even really heard of it. Even though it had passed in 72, and this was 73 or early 74, I think it was 73. anyway, it was not the media landscape we have today. So I quickly called all these people, wrote columns and all this stuff about Title IX. And you mentioned, Tim, that AIW was going on in the 70s. Indeed, it was. It had actually started in the early 70s, and it was running the women's program. So it preceded Title IX by a little bit. And then when Title IX started coming into play, their organizational goals and what they wanted out of sports was a little bit different than what the law was calling for. They wanted a more, they didn't want heavy recruiting. They didn't want these, uh, arms races around facilities. They wanted great competition and they wanted everybody to play, but they didn't want to model what they were seeing in the men's programs. So it was a very distinct, different model. And their first big change they had to make was allowing scholarships, athletic scholarships. Title IX said you have to do it, and they had to allow it to be in compliance with the law. So, yeah, I did live a good bit of this, and it was quite a time of just constant change from the early 70s through till I would say about 79 or so, when things settled down with the regulations. But then there was the fight, and Pam can certainly talk about this, between AIW and the NCAA to run women's basketball and the rest of women's sports.
All right, I want to put a push pin in that because I will come back to that because you guys fell hook, line, and sinker for my 1970s thesis. So, the message, mission accomplished there. But I want to go back a little bit, maybe to give our listeners a bit of an understanding of what it was prior to this time, right? Because there was a college game. You guys sort of hinted at it in various places. You had to kind of maybe look for it. It was probably less, I want to say, regulated or endorsed or easy for women to find places to play and or get scholarships or any of that kind of stuff. But also there was the barnstorming thing, or even either during or earlier than that, even where, more like just a show kind of thing where, the All-American Redheads or the Arkansas Travelers or these it was more of a spectacle of, these women playing this game of basketball, is more of an attraction, if you will, than actually a sport and stuff. So maybe a little bit about sort of the loose fitting assemblage of what women's basketball was prior to the 1970s.
Well, sure. And I think the important thing to know, I mean, beyond high school, and again, it was spotty and where you could, rural areas had it, Black communities had it, most big city white communities didn't unless they were Catholic. It's very interesting pattern. But there was no professional opportunity for women. There were no college scholarships, though there weren't college scholarships for men either, except under the table, which happened a lot. But the main place where there was really high level basketball was the AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union. And the teams that competed there, an awful lot of them were industrial teams. They'd be, sponsored by businesses. Again, here in North Carolina, we had a lot of textile mills. Textile mills hired a lot of women. There were a lot of women working there. And so they started both men's and women's teams sponsored by the mill, to build goodwill, give people something to do. Back then, you didn't travel around and there wasn't TV. So they'd have these teams and they would be really good. Sometimes these women would play together for years and years. And there were also teams at what were called business colleges, which were basically where you went to learn to be a secretary. And those would have teams. Again, these are more working class women. These are not, the wealthier women. And so there are just great, great teams. that play, and they play in the AAU, which is really the women's national the national championship, because there's really not college play at
Pamela,
this.
let me interrupt. Was this, if you will, would this be sort of considered to be sort of a women's version of the industrial leagues kind of dynamic that was going on with the men's even earlier?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And a lot of them, as I said, these textile mills, they employed women and they employed men. So they had, women's teams and men's teams. And of course, if you have a textile mill and the women are, in the mill working every day, they are not delicate or fragile because they're doing textile mill work, which is very hard. You didn't have some of the same objections to women playing a game like basketball that so there were women's industrial to any industry that employed women, you'd pretty much have women's basketball teams, which is pretty cool. But these, particularly Hazel Walker and the Arkansas Travelers, is a great example of a woman who was a great basketball player, and she played for a business college, and was a champion then, and she played then for a series of industrial teams, most of which she actually organized, and then got a team to sponsor, got an industry to sponsor her. And then her husband passed away, and she still wanted to play basketball, but then she also needed to make a living. So she came up with this professional Hazel Walker's Arkansas Travelers that would be a barnstorming team and travel around. She'd actually played for the Redheads for a couple of years, but then she broke off to start her own team. And they would travel, and they had, as you said, entertainment in that they would go in communities, and they only played men's teams. They didn't play, there weren't a lot of other women's, but the idea is that they would come, they would play whoever the top men's team was in this community, and they would beat them because
Of course they
they
would.
were
Well, I would
really,
hope so.
really good. I mean, they played every day together, like for months. So they were really fun players. They were great shooters. And so it was very hard for, a men's team that's just like a community team to beat them. And then they'd play something, they'd play around a little bit, but they were just really good basketball players, and they were doing it because they loved to play basketball. And there were so few opportunities for women to do it, basically after, they finished school or got married. So this was really an exciting thing, but it shows how women just love the sport so much and were willing to, do what they could. There probably would have been a lot of other women doing that if there had been more opportunity.
How lucrative were those situations?
Well, I think they made a living. I mean, they didn't get rich, but they were able to travel, play. They had, they had their cars, they'd go place to place, they'd stay places. I think it was a good life. Like I said, no one got rich on professional sports until they say the 1960s and 70s. So yeah, it was a good life.
And the college game was still very ragtag, right? To your point earlier there, I mean, there was a historically black college playing over here and maybe a few other, maybe you could describe sort of the patchwork that was pre-1970s college game.
Well, essentially there was none. I mean, none of the major colleges that had women's teams. I mean, the major, primarily historically white. I mean, they just they didn't have women's competitive sports teams. That wasn't done. So you had black schools for a period of time here and there. You would have these business colleges again, and these were all over. Sort of start in the 30s, 40s when women are, the women are not just working in factories when they're working, but, start to get these jobs as secretaries and clerks or bank tellers, jobs that used to be done by men, but then, they got kind of outsourced, and then they could pay less if they had women do it. But so there's a lot of these business colleges, and they're all over. And then, there's the occasional four-year college. Wayland Baptist in Texas is well known for that, but there's not very many. Iowa Wesleyan was another, but there is just a handful of colleges. It's really a sport that's rooted in these industrial teams and these business college teams. And then high school, there's a lot of high school, but beyond that, I mean, again, and it's hard to explain it because how do you get your head around there was none? When you see it
That's the
now.
part that is mind blowing, especially when you come back to the 1970s again and recognize that's like, it's almost like that's where people kind of woke up and sort of said and saw what was going on, that there was actual equal, not only equal opportunity, but a real pathway and a real development opportunity for what had not been there before.
Yeah.
There were a handful of teams in colleges in the late 60s, and they were mostly adjuncts to the physical education departments. They were instructors and professors in those departments who really wanted to give opportunities to women to play. But they were just few and far between. When I got to Carolina in 72, they were playing, and they were not under any kind of Title IX edict or anything. They were playing, and it was teachers in the PE department that were running the program under AIW's auspices, and they were well organized, but it was, and all the size schools, from the little tiny schools up to the big schools in North Carolina, all played together. It was, it was one big conference. I covered the state tournament in, I think, 73 of those teams. And it was just kind of hilarious, a big school like Duke just I don't even know that they were there, that they made the tournament, because there hadn't been anybody on that micro level, on the staff side of their PE to start the program. Whereas at Carolina, there was somebody at UNC Greensboro, somebody at Western Carolina, a handful of schools, and they would get together and play a tournament.
Well, and if you look, it's so interesting. Yeah, starts out being all these small schools that are kind of able to get on the bandwagon and and just put together these really good teams because they pay attention, and you don't need that many players for a basketball team. And you look, I can't Pearl Moore, who holds the all-time college record for points scored in a career at 4,000 something. I mean, way over Caitlin Clark, way over Pistol Pete. She played for this itty bitty college in South Carolina.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and she was obviously really, really, really good. But it was just these little places where really interesting things were happening at that time.
Were there other sort of regions, pockets of devotion, if you will, to the game, and maybe creating a little something more of? Because you mentioned the AIAW kind of maybe being a tad bit earlier than Title IX and that kind of stuff. I'm just curious as to how they decided to make that happen, because they must have seen some pockets elsewhere too of some schools starting to kind of be in need of some organizational help.
Well, I think a lot of it actually was that there were a lot of physical education structures, women who had played in high school and who loved it, and who then there was nothing. I mean, again, there was no way to keep playing. You would go to college, and because you were into athletics and stuff, you'd become a PE teacher, but physical education departments didn't encourage particularly high level play. And so, there are a bunch of women that I think felt quite stymied by this lack of opportunity, who then, when there starts to be opportunity, try to make what they can. And then when there starts to be Title IX and it's clear there's going to be some real resources devoted, just seize it.
Yeah.
So I want to bring it back to the 70s again, because there's one area that I want to use it again as a launching pad now to look forward from that period of time. There's another thing we kind of glanced over, actually never even discussed yet, and that was something that happened in 1976 in Montreal, which was the addition of women's basketball to the Olympic Games. And I'm guessing that with the first couple of years of the AIW, some teams really starting to roll around, college game kind of starting to grow and stuff. And frankly, the Olympics taking notice that there was probably a lot of pent up interest that maybe this was going to be a showcase and then some going forward.
Well, it's interesting that you put it that way, Tim, because the people in the United States who were running the Olympic program felt like the women, yeah, they could have a team from here, but they were so far behind other countries that they really wouldn't have much of a shot. But the women themselves, when they were given the opportunity to try out, hundreds came. And they, it was a well-run tryout. And then they picked the team and they went, they were much better than they ever anticipated. And they wound up doing quite well in Montreal. I think, didn't they get the silver up there,
They did, yeah.
Pam? Yeah. And it just shocked everybody in the hierarchy, just about. I'm sure there was somebody that anticipated it, but the women themselves just were grabbing onto that opportunity. Pat Summitt was in that group. Billy Moore was the coach. She was a very well-developed coach, very serious. Um, and they just, they were eager, and they had developed some skills from these communities like we've been describing, that where teams were hanging on or popping up uh, at the high school or college level. So it was quite an achievement.
So would you say that going into the games, then there wasn't a big expectation, but perhaps coming out of the games, there was a mighty tailwind now that, especially given how the U.S. basically came out of nowhere to kind of, grab the silver with really very little infrastructure behind it prior.
I would say absolutely, and I think it had a contributing force to the momentum that carried in, and as Title IX was picking up pace, they continued to work on those regulations, trying to get those things right. And then, of course, you had the WBL, who came along in 1978, just 2 years after those Olympics. So I think it all was working together to provide that tailwind.
And I think one of the important parts is, again, it was really hard. I mean, these women were fighting all sorts of different battles. And so to have these things that give you that little extra energy, that in some ways give you a little more hope, I think that was just really important in keeping everybody going.
But the college games certainly benefited most immediately, right?
Oh,
Sure.
from Title IX, yes.
And
Well,
from the
the Olympics too, right? I mean, the idea of like maybe colleges actually, devoting more resources or actually starting programs for the first time.
Oh, yes. Yeah, in fact, we talk about how some of these women, some of them like Pat Summitt and others, they were either just out of college or about to finish college, and their job opportunities were just enormous. In terms of, they could go right in as a head coach of a college women's program at many places because they had not had that. They were making it available. There was no one in the position. And so they were hiring all these young people. And we tell the story in the book about how the men coming out at the same time were coming into these classes where they're finishing up grad school, and they're saying, oh yeah, gosh, I'm going to be the junior high coach at XYZ high school. I'm so excited. And then one of these women would walk in and say, well, I'm the new head coach at XYZ college. And it was just quite a different time, and I'm sure those men were like, oh my gosh, I've got a long way to work my way up. But those women got some great opportunities very early because of the law.
What of the WBL? I mean, it only lasted a handful of seasons. Do you think it was ahead of its time, and especially given the relatively, I don't know, cold start earlier in the decade when there really wasn't much of any kind of infrastructure, and here we are 8 years later, you've got a pro league trying to make it against, a lot of other sports out there in the firmament.
Well, and I think it was in some ways, it was ahead of its time. I mean, they were really leaping out saying, we've got all this talent. Let's try to give these women another level. But it is hard to start a pro league. I think any of us who followed sports, the number of pro leagues in multiple sports that have been founded and then, fizzed out over a couple, 3 years because People say, oh, well, if it's popular, it'll survive. But for a pro team to survive, you need owners who are willing to put in money. You need sponsors, like corporate sponsors, basically, that are willing to put in money. You need a really good publicity apparatus. There's all these things that need to happen, and it is really difficult to build them up from scratch. So I think that's partly what the WBL was up against. And lots of these other leagues that have come and gone, the ones that have survived and built are really the ones that, for whatever fortuitous confluence of circumstances, made it possible for them to survive.
I think the 70s also was an interesting era for a number of different reasons. And maybe this is the opportunity or the chance to sort of inject the sexism part of the conversation, right? Because as a kid growing up, red-blooded American male sports fan and stuff, it's very, the idea of a women's basketball league was an intriguing curiosity. I mean, hell, the New Jersey Gems played about 5 miles away from where I grew up, right? But I remember mostly, the beginnings of that as the Dannon twins and, Machine Gun Molly Bolin, who we've had on this show, now Casmer. And with all due respect, that was, there was a sex appeal, frankly, to those kinds of players, right? And I'm sure this is the beginning of a constant battle to get onto the radar of the general sports populace, with or without, the sexy female component to this, either as a marketing hook or as a distraction from the actual playing of the sport. So I don't, can you put that in context a little bit, maybe WBL specifically, but maybe the dual baggage, if you will, of having to break into a new sport, create a new league, and yet have to deal with if you will, the male chauvinist sexism thing?
Well, I think that has only recently gone away to an extent, not even that, because that is so much about how women are sold, in the public and in popular culture. And, that ebbs and flows a little bit as well. But I also want to say it's not just appealing to the general public, particularly to the male sports fans, or the people one thinks about as being sports fans, but it's also to the media, which,
Yes.
again, until
Yeah.
recently was basically dominated by men who didn't think much of women's sports, and so who didn't cover it, so that then no one could know about it, and then they wouldn't know if they wanted to go. It was a real catch-22 for these teams, to try to get the interest of these people who could help out, and who came, these sports writers and all. They had their own sports guy, frankly, guy sports writer culture that just really didn't open up to how cool women's sports could be, unless they were wearing skirts or
and the double standard, right? Playing towards the media is a very big element of that. You're absolutely right. Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think that we're just, like Pam said, just beginning to see that really dissipate some. But I still feel like there's still just a lack of identification that a lot of male sports writers have with women's sports. They can't seem to appreciate it like they appreciate men's sports. And it's just kind of mystifying to me. You can look at the quality of the game, and I think that has nudged them forward. And then also the crowds that have been, and the viewership of the last few years have been nudging them as well. But there is still quite among a lot of guys and a lot of women too, for that matter, who just are not. It's just pure sexism is what it is.
Well, and if you look at, I think they say still that the number of features on women on SportsCenter is still in the single digits, percentage-wise. Just to show you, how it's not part of, it's not made an integral part of the sporting media universe in very powerful institutions.
Well, I also think too we're benefiting. It's the best of times and the worst of times if you look at it from a media industry perspective, right? And I have classic old school media experience in agencies and advertising and that kind of stuff, and media and ad tech and that kind of stuff. And the traditional methods and the scarcity model of linear television and stuff is definitely waning. But what is also replacing it is stuff like social media and streaming and that kind of stuff. And I would argue it's also creating a much more direct pathway to creating intrigue for lots of things, but especially sports. And I think in the case of women's sports is a huge contributing factor to the, I mean, how else do you explain? I mean, it's been an explosion, not in the WNBA, right, has gotten resuscitated. That's the only word I can think of, right? The NWSL on the soccer front, kind of the same thing after 2.5 previous attempts to get a pro women's soccer league going too, right? It's just now with Athletes Unlimited, with the softball thing. I mean, just on and on and on. It's truly a phenomenon. But I guess I'm just curious as to maybe how. I think it's different this time. I really do. And I think maybe that sort of, we're not necessarily needing to have it filtered by male dominated sports writers or sports media per se, because women or other aficionados of the game, regardless of gender, can get it directly and create a big enough marketplace. Thank you very much.
Well, I think absolutely. But again, you got to keep focusing on those corporate partnerships. And Susan, I think you can talk about Ally Bank and the Women's Soccer League and how that plays into the whole thing.
Yeah, we talked about how Ally Bank is an example of a corporation that has invested in sports for a long time. Tim, you may know that from some of your agency background. Since that bank was created coming out of the recession, they have been a sports sponsor. Well, when over time, when they had different people in leadership, they began to look at the makeup of where all this money's going. Well, it was mostly going to men's sports. Well, when the last, I guess it was the late 2015 to 18, somewhere in there, the person running the marketing department for Ally had been a college soccer player in the 80s, thanks to Title IX, and she was just flabbergasted that they weren't doing anything to speak of in women's sports. I mean, just piddling stuff. So she dug down in it, and she sort of saw the complexity of how, the NWSL had bad time slots, therefore they couldn't get good sponsors, therefore the league was struggling. I mean, they were just barely getting by. So this is, yeah. So so anyway, they put their shoulders to the wheel to try to change that. And they really did. They worked directly with the league. They put money into it. They helped their players association when that big scandal broke, with the sex scandal, with the abuse with the coaches. And I think the fact that she and the women, they were all women in the marketing team, and they had all played college sports, and they just said, this is bogus. There are opportunities here, but the deck is stacked because of basically TV being so bad.
And one thing that they did was that at the year, I want to say it's 22 or 23, the soccer championship, they bought a primetime slot.
Yes.
ESPN was not going to put them in prime time. And they basically said, look, they're a sponsor. We'll put in X amount of money, to buy ads or whatnot if you will move it to prime time. And, that's how things get in prime time. They can make money. And they did, and it was a great success. And then the league was able to sign a much more favorable, they basically were able to sign a TV contract for way more than they had in the past, because making that effort, moving it to prime time, showing how many people really did want to watch it, just upped their value tremendously. But it took stuff like that.
Taking it back to the 80s for a second, we did mention earlier, I want to kind of double down on this and use this as the velocity enhancer going forward to today's stuff that we're kind of nibbling around. You mentioned before, in 1982, the NCAA coming into the women's game and stuff. I'm a little murky on the details, but how does that happen relative to what the AIAW had done prior? And ultimately, it seems to me like that's another inflection point for the collegiate game for sure, and maybe even a renewed sense of maybe pro down the road.
Well, it's an inflection point in two ways. Number one, to me, it's basically men taking over the women's game. NCAA was run by men. AIAW was run by women. It had become at that point clear that a bunch of money was going to have to be spent on women's sports. Sort of the Title IX battles had been fought. So this was clearly going to be a big thing. And the NCAA wanted to control it, just flat out simple. And they were able to take it over partly just because they had a lot more money, so they could have a tournament where they actually paid teams to come. They could take some of their money that they'd been making from men's sports and use it to entice, teams to go to the NCAA tournament and rather than go to the AIAW tournament. And they could offer better arenas. They could offer, potentially bigger audiences. So that's essential. I mean, the AIAW just could not compete with the money that the NCAA had. So once they were determined to get, as it were, women's sports, they did. And then they basically treated it largely like a second thought. It was the same thing where the people who were determined, the coaches and players and all, still had to keep fighting for something like equality, because the NCAA was much more focused on the big time men's sports.
I think I hear a double-edged sword tinge from your comment there, right? You've got the business opportunities and more, viable tournaments and money and that kind of stuff. But it also sounds like the soul and the women-centric version of what got them to that thing was being lost.
Well, it was lost. And again, you didn't have women on this other side promoting. I mean, they started to promote the vision. There were women who really wanted the more male-focused competition, travel, and all of that, but they were definitely not in charge. And so you got more opportunities, but you were sort of, you were not the central, focus of the people who were controlling the money and making the decisions about where tournaments were going to be and how much of it, all those kinds of decisions. You weren't their first, the women were not their first thought when they started making policies.
Yeah, like both of you, well, I know Pam mentioned it's really about the money. And it was also from the athletic director's perspective, they wanted a simpler model. They wanted all their sports under one organization rather than dealing with two. And I think, the combination, the college presidents sort of fell in line with the ADs and, poof, the AIAW was not really given any real running room. They were a smaller, less, flush organization, and they had been doing all the hard work. But, they just, could not keep up with those two factors.
But also more scholarships and more programs being built, though. No, I mean that's the silver lining, perhaps, if there is for that dynamic.
Yeah, more money. But the sad thing was that the NCAA fought Title IX through the 70s. I mean, they tried to kill it.
Yep.
I mean, literally kill it.
That's a very interesting point, right? That's a huge.
And then when they failed, and it was the first failure by them in any kind of big movement like this politically, it was the first time they had never been successful. Then they decided, okay, we're going to control it because we can't kill it.
Yeah, and even only recently is that have some of the equality desires or necessities even being met. Like, for example, the Final Four, right? Getting to that sort of level of equality, at least on the national tournament basis and stuff, right? Where the conditions and the how players get to tournaments and versus their male counterparts and stuff. I mean, we were debating that just even a couple of years ago, even now still.
Yeah, it just became so clear in that pandemic tournament. Before, they were kind of scattered around. You played early rounds here and there. And so it just wasn't as focused as to the difference between the men's and women's, what they were getting. But then when they, put them in these one each in like in San Antonio and in Indianapolis, then the differences were just so stark that again, it's the kind of thing where almost you become inured to it. You get kind of like, well, of course the men's tournament is, a bigger deal than the women's tournament. And, because that's just how things are and, et cetera, et cetera. But then when you really, are focused on how incredibly unequal it is, in its institution, it's supposed to be educating, then, you've got to really rethink and start again.
I'd almost make the argument though that maybe the advances that the pro game had made for the women's game almost maybe backhandedly kind of even further forced the hand of the NCAA for these kinds of things.
Well, I think it has helped really bring given players a lot more confidence. I think female athletes just have more confidence than many of their predecessors just because they've been offered more, they see more up ahead. And so they're not just, it used to be, you just had a team and that was great because there didn't used to be a team and now there was a team. And so you were happy with that. But now you have these young women who are like, yeah, we have a team. This is great. But things are not equal and that's wrong. And we need, really pushing for real equality as opposed to just, trying to make the more baby steps of the past. What do you think, Susan?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think it began to change where the women were less content with just their small part of the loaf. Probably a little over 10 years ago. Muffet McGraw talked to us about how some of her players at Notre Dame were just so much more outspoken and so much more, oh, we shouldn't have to put up with this. And, and she saw a real change from the prior generations around what Pam was saying, the expectations of more equity. And that was really interesting. She's a very reflective kind of person. And McGraw said, and one player she cited was Skylar Diggins. She said Skylar was just a very outspoken, self-assured, confident young woman who, just would not take guff off anybody. And sometimes Muffet early on kind of thought, well, maybe we ought to just be a little more on the down low around whatever the issue was. And but she stepped back from it and she said, no, I'm gonna let these players be who they are. And of course, we know the success she had, and they won. I think it was 2018. They won that national title. So she was dealing with this kind of player at that time.
There also may be a bit of that generational thing happening again. And I guess I want to sort of corral the last set of questions around maybe the most recent components of the history here, right? And I'm specifically talking about the late 90s and not one, but two pro leagues. Maybe a little bit of understanding about why that happened at that time, how those two leagues kind of, try to carve out their own sort of vision, if you will, of a women's pro league. And then, then the sort of the burying of hatchet, the sort of denouement, if you will, the sort of the ditch, if you will, for a number of years, where even the WNBA wasn't necessarily going to happen much longer without the NBA's further help. And then all of a sudden, seemingly, it renews itself into what is now flourishing. I guess I'm just curious as to how that sort of little microcosm of activity began, consolidated, kind of went sideways for a little while and then kind of just literally took off?
Well,
Well,
I think the kernel of it, Tim, was coming out of the '96 Olympic team. They were so roundly successful, and they had corporate investment sponsoring them for a year of practice as a team, traveling around the world, playing lots of different teams, and they were excellent. Tara Vanderveer coached them, and then they won the gold medal. And it was very exciting. It captured very big attention nationally. The NBA, seeing this, said, well, maybe the corporate investment now and the visibility of the programs are high, or the players rather, are high enough that we could get a league going. And then there was also an ownership group out of San Jose, California, who said, oh, well, maybe we can get a league going. And that was the ABL.
and I
And
think
go ahead, Pam.
I was going to say, and the difference and the challenge, and I think this gets back to other things, and I'm not trying to knock the NBA, but they basically looked at the WNBA as an adjunct of what they were doing,
Brand extension. Yeah, yeah.
Well, because they were going to play during the summer. I mean, they were scheduled for when there wasn't any NBA going on, even though summer is not a traditional basketball time. And the salaries that they were paying, except to the very, very top players, were pretty low. Whereas with the ABL, and the ABL initially got almost all the top players because they were playing in a more more traditional basketball area. They picked places where the women's game was already strong, and they paid more. So, so there really were these two different models.
Was it also a case of maybe the ABL being more of a pure league versus the WNBA, which felt more, I don't know, less than, if you will, in that regard?
Well, they had better players. I think that was, I mean, they were the really
Exactly.
good league in that sense because they had the top players, and then they were, that was all about women's basketball again, is instead of being kind of an adjunct to the NBA and, sort of seeing that, well, you're there because the NBA is paying. On the other hand, I think what happened is we saw, the ABL couldn't maintain its sponsorship, partly because they couldn't compete for TV contracts and stuff with the NBA because they had all the ins. So you really, that made it more difficult. But the fact that the NBA was able to help sustain a lot of the league sort of through a period where, the league could have folded if it didn't have a big, or, a lot of the teams, if they hadn't had, significant backing, you sort of nurtured it through those early years, just like the NBA had been through its early, difficult years where people weren't sure it was going to survive, to get to a point where that it could take off. So, I mean, it is kind of, again, this double-edged sword in a sense. That's how I'd say it anyway. What do you think, Susan?
Yeah, I think the having the backing of the WNBA wound up being helpful, although I agree with Pam about the models. And the ABL was really a players first league. And they, like Pam said, they played during the traditional basketball season. I went to some of those games. They were excellent. But they just could not compete with the corporate sponsors and TV and that the WNBA had. The doors began to close. They actually came out of the gate first. They started playing in the fall of '96. The Olympic team finished that summer. The ABL started in the fall, and but they didn't make it through their third season before they had to close their doors. Um, and the WNBA started in the spring of '97. But they were just, they were just sort of the category owner when they came in. And then, over time, with women's sports being, a difficult sell in our culture, after that newness wears off, and after that excitement from the Olympics has died down, having the WNBA with their resources was very helpful. And like we said early on in 2005 when our book came out, things were going pretty well, and we really thought they were just going to be stair-stepping up. But then we got this kind of pancaking until I would say 2015, 2016. Then you begin to see a little bit of life and growth. It was baffling to us. But it just seemed like the enthusiasm fell off, and then we had the recession,
Yeah.
and that affected everybody, and it certainly affected corporate investment. Um, so I think that was a big factor. And then there were still some things that the WNBA really needed to work out. And then by 2012, they began to start working out some issues that they had. And Pam, you may want to speak to what those were.
Well, there's a number of things. They really are. There are places where they're building grassroots support. We use Seattle as a great example of that. They start the Seattle Storm. At first, they're part of the Supersonics, who are in Seattle. And there was a lot of support in Seattle. People liked the Storm a lot. And they particularly had a large lesbian fan base because there's a lot, WNBA has always had a very strong lesbian fan base. And so you have this, enthusiasm. And then when the Supersonics pick up and run off to Oklahoma, then the Storm didn't go with them because there was enough support. There were a couple of women who decided to buy the team. They bought to buy the Storm and keep them in Seattle as a standalone team. And they did that. And they're, built up this grassroots success. And so it's been really terrific. And selling the team, and these are more and more teams, the players for who they are. Not for women who really want to, the second they stop playing, whip on a dress and do their makeup and run around in high heels, which had been the sort of selling point, but they were basically making these women not who they really were. Some of them like to do it, but
Yeah,
lots.
on that point, well, don't go all American Girls Professional Baseball League on me on that the makeup after the game and stuff at Charles Wrigley. But you kind of buried the lead there because the idea of this. So number one, the Sonics leaving Seattle. This is like that's the sort of untold story about what was left in its wake. But secondly, it was also the first real, I think, example of being decoupled, if you will, from a team in the NBA to share resources and offices and personnel and that kind of stuff, right? So maybe in some respects, some seeds of how to make it, a more independent kind of venture without necessarily, the daddy warbucks of the big league.
Right. And there are teams that have found out how to do that in particular places. Women's basketball is big in Connecticut with UConn. There's independent Connecticut Sun brought there. Susan, you can probably speak to some more.
Yeah, I think the LA Sparks, they're still affiliated, I think, with the Lakers, but they have women involved, at top levels running that. I think the big thing for me is that Seattle was a real pioneer in, as Pam said, letting the athletes be themselves. If they're gay, they're gay. If they're butch, they're butch. If they're not butch, they're not butch. If they're straight, great. If they're not straight, great. On and on. They just embraced the team fully, and they were able to be public about it. And that was very unusual back in the early 2000s. And then by 2010 to 2012, around in there, you had Brittany Griner come through, at Baylor on the college level. And she felt very stifled not being out in college. And then when she was drafted on draft night, she was very pointed about being herself, dressing like she wanted, and then just kind of blowing the doors off and being openly gay. She was one of the first, maybe the first top draft pick that was like that.
Yep.
And then you begin to see more and more teams look harder at this whole issue of should we just, deny or hide our big lesbian base that we have or not. And, eventually the teams all came around and said, no, we're not going to hide it. We know we're going to embrace it. And I think that was a big part of the momentum that fed into the WNBA really beginning to get some wings toward 2015, 2016, that along with, the racial leadership that they took, with Black Lives Matter, which certainly Pam can speak to, that began around that time and continued on to COVID times.
Yeah, back in 2016.
Mhm.
But I think, and the whole point being, women's sports really did, throughout its whole history until recently, was kind of squished into this box of femininity with this idea that female athletes, strong competitive female athletes, are somehow not real women. And they have to spend all this time proving that, as well as being strong athletes, they have all these other, more convenient, like dressing up and wanting to cook and, just can't wait till they get married. And that, just wasn't the reality for a lot of women. And so it gets, you just feel constrained because there's all these things. And even, say women who did want to get married, they're looked upon with suspicion because they're still not, um, you know, they're supposedly not doing something that's quote unquote normal either. And I think it was when, athletes in all these different levels and teams and all were able to just say, okay, we're just not going to pretend, we're that this is how we're trying to be. We are going to be who we are, and we can be women in all sorts of different ways. And some of us can wear high heels and bright red lipstick. And yeah, some of us can, wear jeans and t-shirts, and we'll just go, some of us marry men, some of us marry women, and it's just who we are. And I think in many ways that's very attractive to a
Yeah.
broader range of people than just like trying to get.
And I think I'm sorry. I think you could juxtapose that too with the decline, if you will, of the media monoculture, right? With so many choices and more
Mhm.
direct, individual social media and groups being able to more directly connect with each other and reaffirm themselves that they're not the only ones, in this niche or in this area of interest or commonality and that kind of stuff. And frankly, I think that's also part of the fabric of how the marketing and sponsorship thing and media rights and stuff have gone up, because there's more now a comfort level with some of those things that have now been literally unshackled, as you sort of described before, or unboxed, if you will, right? There's more of an expectation, frankly, an understanding that there's true marketing potential for all these audiences, plural, that were essentially not kind of, I don't know, coming to the surface or not really well known or well understood.
And of course, when you're dealing with, the gay lesbian issue, that was also becoming just, this happens at the same time that repeal, don't ask, don't tell, as you're starting to move, toward gay marriage. I mean, this is part where the culture's changing too. And so it's all that, and sports is always connected to the culture as well. So you can make these strides, you can say we're going to be more open about who we are. And in part, there's a somewhat more welcoming culture to doing that. There's parts of it that are not, and things may be changing now, but they move. It's an interesting dance between sports and society and culture, I think.
Yeah, it's never a straight line, right, Susan?
Absolutely. Ebbing and flowing and having nuance on those ebbs and flows. I mean, that's exactly what Pamela and I saw through the decades, going back to when women started playing up to now. That was a commonality that was, almost startling. But when you think about it, you look at how women are viewed, it shouldn't have been any surprise, really. because, we're always, because we're not in power, that much all the time. We're always being shaped and determined and talked about and, by other people. But then, the more that you get, agency like these players have today, it changes the dynamic because they're not going to be put in a box. They're not going to be shackled. I mean, at the All-Star game, I mean, it was quite impressive what they did. Coming out there in warm-ups in those t-shirts,
Yeah.
pay us what you owe us. And, they risked a lot of criticism from that, but they were unified and dynamic, and the fans really accepted it. I was there. People were very into it. Of course, the game started, which was just kind of a fun fest. It wasn't really a game. But then at the end, they're giving Nafisa Collier, her MVP trophy, and the crowd starts chanting when Kathy Engelbert is out there, the commissioner from WNBA, pay them, pay them, pay them. So I think the players, they are living their lives and they're putting it out there, and they're, of course, in the middle of a big collective bargaining period, and there's a lot on the line.
So that's a great segue to my last question, and then I'm gonna let you guys promote Unfettered. But what of today's WNBA? You think there'll be a strike? What of Unrivaled? Is that going to be a bargaining chip in all of this, or will we see other stuff? Will we see other splinter kinds of things? The international game, obviously has been a place for women pros to either double dip, if you will, or frankly, truly make a living versus being in the United States. Athletes Unlimited kind of came in and went. They're, focusing on other sports and stuff. What of the game now? What of the pro game and the college game for women? And what do you sort of predict sort of in the near term for the women's game?
Well, I think on this collective bargaining thing, I hope they can find a way to meet on common ground, but they've got a ways to go based on what I have read. The players really want an equal share of the revenues being generated, like the NBA players get. And the NBA players are getting around 50%. And the estimates for the women are somewhere between 9% and 20%. That seems to be the biggest contention that they have. I'm hoping that they can find a way to make peace with that between them. I think having a walkout would really throttle momentum for everybody concerned at this point. I think the game is healthy, so maybe you can make the case, okay, you can do a walkout, but I guess I am more of a builder. I like to see people build on what they have in common, find that common ground and move forward. But the players were clearly frustrated in Indianapolis. They just felt like they weren't being heard. And I hope they can, get to a point they are being heard and they can be reasonably satisfied with some agreement. I think it would probably hurt the game, really, if they walked out.
Sports is an asset class now too, private equity and all that kind of stuff, right? So the money's bigger, the businesses are more robust and pronounced. The stakes are higher, right? So I think it's smart to figure out this level of equality now versus later, because we'll see how the economies sort of continue in sports and stuff. I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure that we're not in a bubble from an asset perspective. It just seems to be, multi-billion-dollar enterprises now. I get, with real estate attached to it and stuff. I mean, these things are not sports purely anymore. But there's a lot more risk, shall we say, right? And I don't, if you risk losing the players that are the vital cog of all of this, well, maybe that's the leverage that they recognize that they have, and no better time to exercise it than now to make sure that the future doesn't go away from them.
Yeah, perhaps. I think, that the players have a pretty strong case to get paid a more equitable percentage. Their media deal went from 60 million a year to 200 million a year. While that still pales beside the NBA, that's a huge increase. And the new franchises that are just announced a few months ago, they're each coming in at 250 million each. And a number of economists have looked at this and they said there is definitely room for the WNBA to pay them more without harming what the WNBA has to be about. So I don't have any particular knowledge other than what I read. But it's something that's just really got to be worked on.
Well, heck,
And nothing will happen if the athletes don't speak out. I mean, that's the thing about a union. Nobody's just going to walk up and hand you anything. You've got to, ask for it and make it clear that that's what you want. And I think that is definitely, they're doing that very effectively. And otherwise, they just keep bumping along at the same level because that's just how it works.
Well, yeah, I mean, you also think about it too, from an asset perspective, right? The NBA, I mean, if you think about it, the asset that is the WNBA could easily be sold or spun off, right? And then making money for a lot. I mean, there's a lot of different sort of economic scenarios that were unthinkable just even 10 years ago, right? With this. But in many respects, it's also, be careful what you wish for. But also, look, these are bigger problems now. But arguably, it's a. You could make a very strong argument that the game of women's basketball, especially at the pro level, to have this kind of headache in front of them is just an example of just how far it has come in such a relatively short period of time.
Oh yeah, it's terrific. Oh yeah, good problems to have.
Absolutely.
All right, well, okay, in 5 years, ladies, when you do the third version of this book, what are you going to be telling me that's happened in 5 years historically? What do you think? I mean, unrivaled, do you think that's a challenger? Do you think there'll be a challenger league to the WNBA because they're only in a handful of cities? Do you think, what do you think?
Well, I'm going to let Susan do this because I'm going to pull my historian's hat out and say, knowing what happened in the past does not tell you what's going to happen in the future.
Good answer, Professor.
So I tend not to predict. And also I'm more of the historian. So I'll let Susan give that a go.
Yeah, I predict that they will add some more franchises to the WNBA. Now, whether they spin off, like you mentioned, that's a really interesting proposition. There are a lot of people with deep pockets coming into the women's game, and it may be that there's a path that they see for those people, and I'm thinking mainly of women, but it could be guys too, that just want to run the league as an independent entity. I mean, it doesn't seem far-fetched, but it would be a big lift. As far as, I mean, still, even though they've got a lot of gravitas, unrivaled, man, they came out of the gate with a fabulous media contract. It's going to continue going into this coming year, and they paid the players extremely well for a short period of time. In other words, they didn't have to play, but a couple months, but they got really good salaries for that period of time. Maybe they're the ones that can do it, if the NBA really wants to let go of it or sell it. They seem to really have a level of business and media savvy that is just quite high. Nafisa Collier and her husband, who is a marketing expert, are the initial instigators, and I wouldn't be surprised if that morphs into more. Now, what form it will take, I don't know. But people seem to like that product. Personally, I like the traditional game more, but they were able to get people to watch it, and we'll see how it plays out from here on the second season.
And lastly, on the college side, how do you feel about NIL and money and all that kind of stuff? I mean, basically, no more amateurism and ladies getting paid. Frankly, not probably near the men, but that's another equality challenge. But I mean, there's money now in the college game, so that's also arguably another place where you're pro, at least for a while, right? A couple of 4 years, maybe, or a few years.
Yeah, I
Oh,
think,
that's a big
go ahead,
old-
Pam.
I was just going to say, I think people don't really know how that's falling out yet. I mean, again, this is one of these, as a historian, I say to myself, it's going to be 10 to 15 years before we have any idea what this has really been about. You know, there's sort of beginnings of things, and you have these collectives, and then you have these, you can get these sponsorships and all, but it's still all really in flux.
I'll make a prediction. I think it's a disaster. I mean, it's completely just undermines the entire. We talked about some of the early history, with all due respect, of how women and the AIAW, for example, their approach to, I think we've completely lost sense of how college athletics should enhance the college overall experience, and now all of a sudden it's an industry. I mean, it was kind of always a whatever. Money's always been part of it, but it just feels. I'm not sure history's going to treat this era kindly at the end of the day.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, Tim. I think that it is a hodgepodge mess, and I think the schools that aren't loaded are pretty much out of it now. You know, they're just feeder schools for players that somehow want to make it to the schools that are loaded. And I mean, that's no way to run college athletics. I mean, what's exciting about college athletics is, the diversity of teams that you get. There's always been ones that tend to be at the top, but there's always the Cinderellas, the ones in the mid-range. Well, that mid-range is just, and lower, it's just gutted now. I don't know how. I mean, they're just going to be like the minor leagues. And it makes me sick. I mean, I wrote a history of Army West Point women's basketball. I mean, they're fortunate. They don't have to deal with the NIL. But, you look at all these other mid-majors, what the heck are they going to do? I mean, I know of a coach that was at a mid-major in the Patriot League, and she had a player, come into her school, and she was offering her some NIL. I don't know how much it was. But then at the last minute, that player got $70,000 more from another school. And boom, she was gone. This was a year ago. And that's just a tiny little example. I mean, that's just nothing to what's really happening. And so I don't know what's going to mitigate it. Something's going to have to mitigate it. Otherwise, you're just going to have, I think, a very boring sort of, we have the money and we're gonna dominate kind of college game, and that's not fun. It's boring.
Man, I have a much greater appreciation for what's going on now in the WNBA and Unrivaled and just the future of not only the pro game, but the collegiate game on the women's level. And I cannot thank Pamela and Susan enough for that backgrounder and insight. And again, I highly encourage you to check out some of our previous episodes that we've talked about women's basketball, including and especially our episode number 28 with the great Molly Boland-Casmer, or Molly Casmer, as I think she goes by now, the Machine Gun Molly, as you might remember her from the old WBL. And check out also episode 256, which was our WBL Roundtable, which featured Molly and the aforementioned Liz Galloway-McQuitter and a few other ladies. And that was a great first-person setup and remembrance of that foundational league, as you have since learned. And also check out our episode 399 with Marie Fernandez Harris. He said it's a long name. Got a lot of long names there in the women's game, but that's okay. She was one of the initial players and pioneers, frankly, of the early days of the WNBA. All of those are great compliments to this wonderful conversation with the ladies we just had. And of course, the book you should run and not walk to get is a reissue with a little freshening up called Shattering the Glass. And it is subtitled The Remarkable History of Women's Basketball. And it is indeed remarkable for sure. It is published by the University of North Carolina Press. And of course, you can find it wherever good books are found. Your local bookseller should, if they don't have it on the shelf, you can certainly order it through them. But of course, if you'd like to give us a couple of shekels of referral love and help us keep our lights on, we'd love it if you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode 408, I think is the number. Yeah, with Pamela and Susan and me. And you'll find a couple of convenient links to the Amazon machine there that will get you the Kindle version, the paperback version, the no-cost audio book version with a membership trial. Hell, if you want to buy the $99 hardcover, go for it. But there are less expensive ways to get this book. Paperback is just fine, thank you. The book has also a website, which I highly recommend you check out. Lots of good photos and further background there. It's called Shattering the Glass Book. All one word.com, shatteringtheglassbook.com. And of course, the ladies will be on the road, promoting. That's what I'm trying to say. Their current wares. And if you're in Iowa coming up later in September, well, check them out on the 25th of September at the Ames Public Library, which I think is also live streamed by the Iowa Center of the Book. Friday, the 26th of September, they'll be at the State Historical Society of Iowa Museum in Des Moines. And on the 28th of September, I think it's a Sunday, they'll be up in the Okoboji Lakes area, a beautiful section of Iowa, at the Lakeside Lab there in Milford, Iowa. So check them out. And if you happen to meet them, get their book signed, whatever, take a picture and send it to us and let us know that you saw them and you found out about them through us and this here little show. We appreciate it, and I hope they do too. I'm sure they will. Our website again, goodseatsstillavailable.com. Lots of good stuff there, merch and stuff. Check that out. All of our episodes are posted there. You can search them up. It's a big search bar there. You can kind of pick any topic that you might be interested in. And chances are pretty good that we've at least had a little bit of a conversation about it, if not in depth. We're on all the socials. You'll find us on X at Good Seats Still. You'll find us on Blue Sky at goodseatsstillavailable.com. And just about everywhere else at Good Seats Still Available, all one word, including YouTube, where we also post and stream these shows. Our email address is hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And our thanks, as always, to the great Jerry Payne, Dr. Jerry Payne, for his audio excellence this week. Thank you, sir. As always, we tip our New Jersey Gems commemorative cap in your general direction this week. Thank you very much for all of your help. He's been with us since 7+ years, and so he's been a rock for us, and we greatly appreciate it. We just don't thank him enough. And thank you. We don't thank you enough, I don't think, for listening this far and this long for this show. We'd love to keep doing this for you, and more fun, frivolity, and you get a little new tweaks coming up. And I think you'll enjoy, hopefully, all of those. And of course, thank you for listening. We'll see you next week.